Hey, welcome to my channel. For those who don't know me, my name's Tammy, and I'm a 50-year-old mother of three who had a six-figure career, recently shifted into coaching consulting. And in the midst of all that, I was starting to experience a lot of symptoms, some perimenopausal symptoms. I want to share with you my experience on that piece and share also some wins that I've had recently around this. Perimenopause has been a major disruptor in my life. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started going to the doctor more frequently because I was starting to have a lot of symptoms. Part of the symptoms were related to physical burnout or mental burnout that I was having from my work. I worked in the federal government in Canada in public health. And obviously, when COVID hit, I was already kind of burnt out when COVID hit. But when COVID hit, and I found myself on the other end of being an executive, managing a team of people and having to work 14 and 16 and 18-hour days consistently for many, many, many months, I found myself at the fresh end of complete burnout. And in the midst of that burnout, I started to have perimenopausal symptoms, which increased over time. And at the age of 50, I've noticed in the last 6 months really started to come to a head. So what are some of those symptoms? I want to share that with you because maybe you're wondering, do I have perimenopause? Is this something that I'm possibly struggling with? So if you're between the ages of 35 and 50, there's a good chance that if you have these symptoms, you may be dealing with perimenopause. And yes, it can go as young as 35. I have a resource by the name of Dr. Clare Haver. If you follow her on TikTok, and I'll have her link down below so that you can go on TikTok and also to her website, because she's an extremely fantastic advocate, but also resource for us ladies with perimenopause. So I would recommend you check out. She has a YouTube channel that she posts on sort of sporadically, but TikTok is really where she's at. But I'll put all the links for her down below so you can follow her. But essentially, she will explain the math as to how young a person can be with perimenopause. And the reality is it can go as low as 35. Some of the symptoms I had that are common are things like moodiness. Maybe you cry more. Maybe you're a little bit more agitated. You find yourself not sleeping well. You're waking up multiple times a night. Maybe you're finding that your bladder is a little less tolerant. For example, you're going to get up to go to the washroom more frequently at night or during the day. And when you go, maybe you have some spasms, which people say, well, you just have a urinary tract infection. Well, you know what? If you're not diabetic and you're having these symptoms, the chances are it's a perimenopausal issue, because I started to have more urinary tract infections and I started to have more bladder issues with respect to being agitated and needing to go to the washroom more frequently as I entered perimenopause. Another symptom is extreme fatigue. I just found myself super tired, and my doctor kept saying, well, maybe it's just because you're depressed. But the reality is this wasn't just like a mental fatigue. This was a physical fatigue. Like I had mononucleosis or the flu, where I would have parts of my month where even just going up the stairs, my legs felt really heavy and like they were weighted in some way. I didn't necessarily feel winded. I was just really, really tired. I started to have these really weird symptoms, like my skin would get really itchy, like the palms of my hands. And I started doing research on, of course, on the internet. It's like, you have liver cancer. No, I didn't have liver cancer, but it was just like everything was itchy. My skin got really dry. My eyes got dry. I thought, okay, I'm diabetic because my eyes are getting dry. Perimenopause. Another symptom that I had were headaches. I had increased levels of headaches. In particular, at certain times of the month, I would get more headaches. And I started getting my visual auras that I used to have in my 20s when I would have like minor migraine sort of headaches where I get flashes of light in my peripheral vision. Again, that was also associated with blood pressure. And my blood pressure, as a result, was starting to also go up with perimenopause, because as your estrogen starts to drop and the plasticity starts to wane on your coronary arteries, your blood pressure starts to spike up. So estrogen tends to relax things and keep things smooth. And as that drops over time in your perimenopausal phase, your blood pressure will start to go up. Somebody who's diabetic might start to see their sugars be less controlled in perimenopause, because again, it has a direct implication. When your estrogen levels drop, the way your insulin reacts and responds, the way your sugar reacts and responds changes. So you might start to see an increase in sugar levels. I personally am not diabetic, but I did notice that my fasting sugars in the morning were starting to creep up. Another sign and symptom that I had was brain fog. You know that brain fog, for those who've had children out there, you have brain fog and you're like, oh, when you're pregnant, they call it mommy brain, where you get pregnant, your hormones are kind of out of whack and you can't remember where you put your keys and you don't know where you were supposed to go. You walk in a room and you're like, why am I here? This started to happen to me again. And I found that I was having trouble finding my words. I seriously thought I had dementia. I thought, okay, I got to go get assessed because there's something wrong with my brain. No, perimenopause. I started to have dry mouth, which is an odd symptom. But again, my throat, my tongue started to feel like it had thrush. I did not have thrush, but my throat, everything seemed to be drying up. I also found that I was very impatient, and more so than my usual level of impatience because I'm very type A, but I found myself to be really impatient. I started to get these weird numbness feelings in my fingers and toes to the point where I thought I need to get an MRI. And when I went into my doctor's office, she would not prescribe it for me. So I went to a sports medicine guy to get a different opinion. And he said, yeah, you need an MRI. You're having numbness and tingling in your legs and toes. We need to see what's going on with your spinal column. Now, I went for that MRI not that long ago, and I don't have the results. But given that I haven't heard from them, I'm assuming nothing serious. I suspect that those symptoms are also related to perimenopause. The other big key is changes in your cycle. So I had a major changes in my cycle where in the last 6 to 8 months, I noticed that my periods were either getting super long or really short, or 1 month it was super heavy with clots, and next month it was barely anything. So you start to see these shifts, and your actual monthly cycle may change. It may go from 28 days, maybe you were like every 28 days for 20 years, but for whatever reason now it's going to 30 and 32 day lengths or even shorter. So I also had periods of time during the last year where I would actually have a period, seemed relatively normal, and then 2 weeks later I would bleed again. I thought, I'm having spotting. This is dangerous. Don't I have cancer or something? And of course, that's not the case at all. When you have perimenopause, you can actually have spot bleeding or breakthrough bleeding through the month. It's pretty disconcerting when that happens, and it's super frustrating to have 2 and 3 periods in a month. But that lasted only for a period of time, and then it just kind of waned, and now I'm back on a monthly cycle. Because when you're in perimenopause, your hormones are kind of all over the place. And so you can have like 32 and 36 day intervals between your period. Eventually they get longer and longer, your periods get shorter and shorter, and eventually they just stop. But before they do, you're going to have these cycles. I had increased premenstrual pain and discomforts, increased bloating that I didn't have when I was in my 30s. So this is the kind of stuff I started having when I was 14 and 15, when you're in like puberty and your hormones are raging. Well, those symptoms of PMS that I had at that age returned at the age of 49 and 50. So I started having more abdominal pains and a lot more discomfort around just before my period. Where I had an increased libido in my late 30s to mid 40s, I started finding that my libido was being affected. So in my 49 age bracket is when I started to notice that my libido was starting to take a little bit of a dip, and that there were times where my excitability would just like disappear, like mid circumstances. I'll just leave it at that. So my point being is that the libido, i.e. your testosterone levels, that also start to drop and shift in perimenopause. Testosterone is primarily the driver behind your sex drive. That started to kind of wane for me. And so I noticed that my libido was starting to go down, and it wasn't really affecting my relationship, but it really, for myself personally, was discomforting because I knew that this was a shift and a change. And the symptom that really kind of threw me over the edge, where I decided I needed to do something and reach out to a doctor, was palpitations. Now, palpitations are normal. They're normal, period. Everybody has them, where you have a little skip beat once in a while during the day. Most of the time, people don't even know that they've had them. It's a completely normal and benign situation. However, when you get into perimenopause, especially if you have a condition like I do called supraventricular tachycardia, or SVT as it's called, it can actually trigger SVT situations or increased palpitations where you have like a tachycardic event or arrhythmia for a longer period of time. Now, palpitations are super uncomfortable. They can be super nerve-wracking, and 95% of the time are very benign. There's nothing to be concerned about. However, the older we get as women and the less protective we are with estrogen, the more we have to be concerned with a cardiac event, for example. So that's something that really, for me, started to become like a push towards getting the help I needed to get my hormones under control. So there's some pretty clear evidence and information out there on why we get more palpitations when our estrogen levels decrease and when our progesterone levels are out of balance. So the reality is that progesterone, if it's higher than estrogen, so if your estrogen levels drop, progesterone is what they call an arrhythmia burden. It will increase your arrhythmia burden or your potential to have an arrhythmic event. Whereas estrogen th- tends to help mitigate that and kind of keep the sinus node behaving. The sinus node is your heart pacemaker, your natural pacemaker in your heart. And that sinus node controls how many beats per minute your heart beats. And it kind of gets a little out of whack when estrogen is not there because we have estrogen receptors throughout our entire body. So the estrogen receptors in our heart are a big component of that. So I started having more increased palpitations about a year before I started to seek help. I ended up having a cardiology conversation, and everybody thought it's in her head. She's crazy. She's just anxious. It's just anxiety. But I knew something had changed because I was getting dizzy spells with my palpitations. It was changing for me. I didn't feel right after I had an episode. I felt tired after, and I thought something's wrong, something's up. And it came to a head for me about 2.5 weeks ago, where I had an event where I went into a supraventricular tachycardia event. My heart rate was beating between 178 and 200 beats per minute. Normally, in the last 35 years since I've been diagnosed or since I've had this situation, I would just hold my breath and do yoga breathing and do what's called vasovagal maneuvers to push my heart rate back into a normal sinus rhythm. Unfortunately, after a couple of minutes, it became very clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to do this. We called 911, and it was a damn good thing we did because about 20 minutes into having this heart rate, the paramedics were taking ECGs and putting IV lines in my body in the middle of my living room in my house with my kids watching. My blood pressure dropped to 80 on 68. I don't know if you guys know anything about medicine, but that's not good. And I started to see stars and felt like I was going to pass out. And so they had to give me a dose of a medication called adenosine. Luckily, I only needed the first dose, the 6 milligram dose, but I needed adenosine to medically cardio convert my heart rate back into a normal sinus rhythm. By that time, my adrenaline was running through my body. I was shaking like a leaf in sort of a shock sort of state, and so it took a while for my heart rate to drop below 100 again. But the reality is that I needed that drug, and I had never needed that drug for the 35 years I've had this situation happen to me. I've always been able to convert myself, and in this instance, I was not able to convert myself. And the reason is because the problem with my heart trigger wasn't mechanical, it wasn't fluid based, it was based purely on hormonal electrolyte issues. So, perimenopause will throw your heart rate for a loop at times and cause these palpitations. And I want to share with you that there are things you can do that will help you with this. And there'll be more information on this channel as I go through these signs and symptoms and kind of what I did to mitigate them. And finally, a couple other signs and symptoms that are very commonly known with menopause are things like hot flashes. I don't get textbook hot flashes where my face turns red and I get all sweaty and all that. But what I tend to get is a sensation of heat, if you will, where I feel kind of hot and warm throughout. Usually at night when I'm sleeping, where I have to toss the blanket off of me for a couple minutes and then I get cold and I have to cover myself back up. That started to happen more frequently, especially in the last several months of my perimenopausal experience. And finally, the other thing was a lot, and I mean a lot of joint pain. My joints felt like I had arthritis. I felt maybe like I had fibromyalgia. And it was causing anxiety for me because the pain was something I had never experienced before. So, again, estrogen helps us with pain management. And as our estrogen levels drop and our estrogen receptors throughout our body, including those in our joints, start to lack that estrogen, it starts screaming to our body and our brain. And so we start to feel pain. I think about it, it makes sense evolutionary wise. Like I kind of put two and two together. We have a lot of estrogen floating through our body. We have to deliver babies. Our pain tolerance has to be higher. And so it makes sense that estrogen is running through our body and keeping our pain management under control. So therefore, when your estrogen levels drop, that level of pain tolerance goes away with it. And so you start to feel every ache and pain in your body. So that was something, and it also, because estrogen also, when it drops, increases your inflammatory markers. So now all of a sudden, things that you weren't inflamed with before suddenly become inflamed, and all this pain starts to evolve and emerge because of it. So these were the symptoms I had. And as you can tell, there are many, 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 many of them. And you know, the sad thing is, there are others out there. There are blurred visions and dizzy spells and people having numbness and tingling in their toes only, to all sorts of strange and wonderful or not so wonderful signs and symptoms out there. So if these resonate with you, you likely are suffering from perimenopause and menopause. Well, on this channel, I'm going to share things, my experience as I experiment with things as I go through. I'm going to share a video on the use of magnesium after I got out of the hospital from SVT while I was waiting for HRT to become a thing for me. HRT is hormone replacement therapy. And I wanted to make sure that I got treated, and I needed to find a practitioner because my own medical doctor gaslit me and continues to gaslight me and will not be supportive in this journey. And so I had to find a practitioner who would support me in this journey to manage my symptoms and to start feeling better. About a week and a half, I reached out to my naturopath, who I started working with about 6 months ago, and said, I need a referral to that nurse practitioner ASAP. I'm starting to have these debilitating symptoms, including my SVT activation. I need to be on hormones because I know this is happening the week before my period. 2 months in a row, I had to call EMS. So it's time that we start having this conversation. I was put in touch with a nurse practitioner. I have the information to their office down below if you're in Ontario, Canada, but otherwise they probably won't treat you. But Clare Haver down below also has a list of practitioners who specialize in this. And so I would recommend you go to her site to find that. But the reality is that I finally, after about a week, had a conversation with them, and they are treating me simply on the use of my symptoms to support treatment. And we're starting on the low doses and we're going to work our way up. But I finally got the first two of the three modalities: Estradot, which is the estrogen or estradiol replacement that I'm going to be receiving. And about a week and a half from now, I'm going to add progesterone. And there's reasons why. You don't want, if you still have your uterus, you don't want to be just on estrogen, because this will increase the lining of your uterine wall and it can increase bleeding and other signs and symptoms. You definitely want to counterbalance that with progesterone if you still have your uterus. But again, I just want to share with you my experience using these. I've been on this now for 4 days. I'm on my second patch, and I'll show you on another video kind of how this is put on and what this looks like. But I started this 4 days ago, and I can say that it's very minor changes. I don't have a lot of resolution of all my symptoms, but I can tell you that between this and the magnesium that I'm taking, I've all but eliminated my palpitations. And I would say that I'm starting to feel a little more energy come up. But again, this takes several weeks to fully have an impact. So I'll be sharing my experience with you guys as I go through. And the third item that we'll be adding potentially to the mix is testosterone. But again, we want to see how I respond to these, because I may not necessarily need extra testosterone if these are more imbalanced. So we'll see how that is. But if I do, they're open to having that conversation. And if I do go on that, I will share that with you as well, so you can see what that process and what that looks like. Anyway, just wanted to share today a little bit about my story at the front end, and also to share the signs and symptoms of perimenopause that I was experiencing. And if you resonate with any of this and you want to follow this journey of mine, I'm not just going to be doing content on my perimenopausal journey. I'm also going to talk about my burnout journey and how I kind of overcame burnout and fatigue and those kinds of things as an executive. I'm also going to help talk about courage, the courage to speak up, to stand for yourself, to be your own advocate in your health and in your life. Those are the kind of three main topics of this channel. I welcome you. I look forward to having you. I will try to be here on a weekly basis, but I will post as often as I can so that you can get an update on how things are going for me, so that hopefully you can get some hope in knowing that there's things you can do to help yourself in this entire journey, because you do not need to be a victim of perimenopause. You can completely take control of this. So remember, aging is normal, but suffering is optional. And in this channel, I want to help you get to a point where you are no longer suffering. Let's do this together, folks. Until next time.